Thanks to a recent post by Think Before You Sleep, the discussion of Frieren got revived for a bit. And what it's shown me is that some people are fundamentally confused about what Frieren actually is and what it's supposed to be. Or they just outright want to ignore certain aspects of the series. This has actually become a recurring issue within the anime community, if I'm honest, where people will watch an anime and only really see the surface level of it, where there's something more to the story as a whole. And at large, there are plenty of anime that get railed against for not being good simply because people miss the entire point or get distracted by one very flashy element and don't engage with it on an intellectual level, or even just feel uncomfortable by something that it's covering. I'll spare you the reading of Think Before You Sleep's long spurg-out session on Twitter, because I've already read over it live, and the somewhat edited version of that whole thing will be on my live channel if you're actually interested in my raw reaction and breakdown of everything he said. If you're not interested, though, in that long breakdown, here's the lowdown. Effectively, he missed the entire point of the series, fabricated reasons to hate the show, and proved he likely wasn't paying attention to it at that. And that prompted me to return to Frieren as a topic, explore it, and finally say some things I never got to say about it the last time around. The beauty of Frieren is that it isn't overly complex. It doesn't muddle the pure positive enjoyment of the story with overly dark or dramatic themes. It doesn't try to bog itself down with a complex narrative about the state of the world. At its core, Frieren is supremely simple in narrative direction, character writing, and in theme. It doesn't need to present some grand moral dilemma or challenge the audience on an intellectual level. It doesn't even need to try to be deceptively complex and weave a narrative of twists and turns that keep you awestruck for the entirety of the show. And for better or for worse, this tame, very calm style of storytelling fits in perfectly with the core theme of the series. For the sake of this video, I'm mostly going to be covering just the first season of the anime. I've read pretty far ahead in the manga, but I'm going to try and keep it to just the normie level for now. There seem to be two fundamental things about this show that haters seem to miss or outright ignore. It's okay if you don't like the series, by the way. It's perfectly fine if you hate it or you think it's boring. But there are certain misconceptions that I'd like to straighten out. And the most important of those is that Frieren, at a base level, is a character-focused narrative. It isn't about the journey to the north. It isn't about reuniting with Himmel. Those things are all secondary. The core driving force of the story is Frieren herself and the changes she experiences as a result of her interactions with other people. And that ties in with the major theme of the narrative, which we'll get into. So yeah, the focus of this story is on Frieren herself, the journey of reflection she embarks on as she makes her way back to the scene of her greatest accomplishment in order to have one last meeting with the man who quite literally changed her life. And because of that core part of the series, it probably will come across as somewhat boring to people not interested in this sort of narrative structure. The characters are nothing incredibly complex, but complexity does not necessarily equate to being good. The straightforward goodness of the main cast is what really gives this series its soothing, very relaxing atmosphere, helping contribute to the overall nostalgic vibe it has. It's never been about the epic conquests of the hero's party or some grand journey to reunite with old friends. It's always been about the characters and who they become along the way by reflecting upon old memories and encountering new experiences. But this moves us along to the fundamental point you're supposed to derive from the series. The importance of ordinary things. In the beginning, Frieren is very emotionally disconnected from everything, and brief moments throughout her life carry very little meaning to her as she lives very long. But her journey with him will changes that, and his death makes her realize that she should have been more intentional about appreciating the time she had with him. Live in the moment. Do not take ordinary life for granted. Make sure you treasure those random moments because they will fade quickly. Learn to appreciate those beside you while you have the chance, because they will not be there forever. It's a show about ordinary things. And that's why I said earlier that the show's very low-key and relaxing vibe is a good fit for its theme. Many of the episodes that got called boring filler were written to this end. Half the show is Frieren looking back on things she thought were insignificant at the time, but holds them in high regard now. That's why many of the events in this series are rather tame. Obviously, there are some exciting events that happen. Certain battles that are unavoidable through the highly dangerous Northern Territory. But the core theme of the importance of small moments and learning to appreciate them while they last is a consistent point throughout even those high-octane moments. And that's why I absolutely love this series and consider it one of the best anime I have ever watched. It's simple, yet so packed full of beautiful themes, messages, and positivity that I find it impossible not to love it. That was what initially enchanted me with the manga more than a year and a half ago, with each arc of the story taking some variation of these themes and applying them. The biggest one I can point to is the final arc of Season 1, the Examination arc. One of the key themes of this arc is the difference in the ideologies between Frieren's master Flom and the elven mage Sari. Sari values the exceptional, and she seeks an outstanding individual to bestow her knowledge upon. She's taught countless mages across history, but none of them have ever lived up to her lofty standards. Ultimately, she chases perfection, failing to notice the significant achievements of the ordinary people she sees potential in. Her belief that only the exceptional should be able to wield magic has ultimately resulted in nothing by direct consequence, even failing to produce a challenger to the Demon King. Her inability to see value in anything that isn't special has resulted in a legacy that is effectively nothing. Ironically though, she is somewhat responsible for a lot of other things. One of her students, Flom, would go on to reshape the entire world. As the founder of humanity's magic and the one who ultimately taught Frieren magic, she's one of the most pivotal people in the history of this world. Her belief was the exact opposite of Sari. That magic should be ordinary, and that by teaching it to all, the world would be better. It would be Flom's efforts and ideology towards magic that would prevail in the end, as humanity would rise to greatness due to the power of magic. Frieren would go on to be a critical piece in the defeat of the Demon King, and an otherwise ordinary girl would prove to be the most exceptional mage Sari would ever encounter. Fern's ability to see the fluctuations in Sari's suppressed mana was the pinnacle of driving home how ordinary things could be much greater than they are perceived. In fact, Fern as a character is largely underestimated by those who come up against her, even Frieren, and that is kind of the point. She seems rather ordinary and unspecial. She doesn't use any special techniques, just ordinary attack and defense magic in combat. Her power is not exceptional, and yet she's still the one who impressed one of the greatest mages in the entire history of the world. Even the hero's party was made up of people who were not of exceptional circumstances. Frieren, in spite of her age and what the story would tell you, was very ordinary. Hyder was not a particularly pious priest. Eisen was not a particularly fearless warrior, and Himmel failed to draw the hero's sword of legend and was thus not a chosen one. And for later in the series, we see men take on great ordeals for some very ordinary reasons. In all things, you can always trace the story back to its core concept, and this incredible kind of writing impressed me. It is consistently pleasant and enjoyable every time I pick it up, and the overwhelming popularity of the series has been really heartwarming for me to see. But with all that said, the sad thing is that a lot of people like to jump on the hate train and end up parroting things that turn out to be objectively false. I don't care if you don't like the series, that isn't my issue. Where I get upset is when people try to put on some BS intellectual mask for their own opinions, when in reality it just boils down to their not liking the series. Sometimes it's just a matter of wanting to hate on something that's popular, which is the lamest reason to hate on anything. It's fine to have a taste for something else, or to simply say it's not for me. But like I said when I was live reading that tweet, get your hate right. And you can broaden that out to many shows that I think people fundamentally fail to understand certain aspects of. Alia basically went through the same thing. People who missed the point watched the show and didn't like it. They ended up getting too stuck on the surface level reaction to Yuki's behavior, or being more interested in the progression of a relationship, and failed to look at why all those things happen and what the whole story is about. But I digress on that topic, as I've already done 2 videos related to my opinions on that subject. Ultimately, what I find in all of this is that a lot of these arguments and these bad takes seem to come about as a fundamental disconnect between what the author's intentions for the series are and what that segment of the audience goes to fiction for. In my observation, there are 2 groups of people within the general audience of any given medium. Those who value escapism and those who value meaning. Neither side is inherently more correct in their reasoning for enjoying something, and no given person will wholly be on one side of the line or the other. It's like a spectrum, and you can say the same thing about works of fiction. And this may not be the most perfect way to sum it up, but it's effective as a crude representation of my thoughts, where the vertical axis represents how intricate the story is on a surface level, and the horizontal aspects represent the primary draw of the series. I use message as a catch-all for all the sentiments and lessons the story is meant to convey as the author wrote it, and the excitement being purely escapism. Now, the position of some of these may end up being debatable, but that's not the point. I think you can sort of get what I'm saying from this. The first group, those who value escapism, are generally more interested in something exciting. They lean towards the quick shot of dopamine they get when something cool happens. This is fine, there's no hatred in me for that crowd. I have shows that I enjoy for the exact same reason, but it tends to lean to less intellectual interpretations of any given story. It focuses on events, favors the ideal, and is often terribly simplistic in how it views things. Everything becomes delineated by good and evil, and any sort of small nuance or subtle detail gets lost in the weeds in favor of the bigger and more exhilarating moments. After all, fiction is a form of escapism from the world. It's an excellent way to unburden yourself from the problems that bother you day in and day out. Escaping to an ideal world where you can immerse yourself in the adventures of epic heroes and enjoy life in an idealistic fantasy is a really magical aspect of fiction that should not be overlooked. It's why certain series like Solo Leveling can draw attention so much. It satisfies the needs for excitement and distraction from all of the woes of normal life. The second group, those who value meaning, are generally more interested in finding something applicable in a story. They tend to derive messages from things rather than simply look at the surface. Intellectual and moral challenges satisfy them more than any sort of flashy action, and they tend to get more invested on a personal level with stories. This camp often tries to understand the points of view presented in the story, to see the subtle details, find the good in evil and the evil in good, and look for something to challenge them. Rather than simply escape to the ideal, they'll weigh all things and evaluate them as they really are. This is why stories like Evangelion or Frieren become so popular. They're meant to have some level of that intellectual aspect to them in order to convey some form of meaning. After all, fiction is a powerful form of communication, and has been used to share moral standards and important lessons with people since before recorded history. Though the downside of this way is that you tend to become more and more pretentious as you lean farther to that side. To sum all that up, some stories are meant to just be plain fun. There's no deep meaning to a simple action film. On the other hand, some stories are meant to mean something. Sometimes there's a reason for its existence more than just what happens in the plot. If you lean one way or the other, you're going to find yourself at odds with someone eventually, because people enjoy things for different reasons. I'm of the camp that likes some level of detail and complexity. I like to think. I like to understand the why and how behind actions and events. I tend to derive points from what I watch and try to see what sort of life lessons can be found at any given moment. I have friends who only care about action series. I don't think they delve very deep into the stories they watch, and yet we get along just fine. I know a lot of people love pseudo-harem. I thought it was boring in one note, and conversely, a lot of people thought Alia was slow and boring, yet I loved it and thought it was very thrilling. It's okay to not like something, okay? I'm not gonna judge you for not liking something that I like, but be sure to delineate between when it comes down to taste and when it comes down to actual flaws. Be sure that you're actually approaching it from the right point of view, and not totally missing the point of why the series was created and what it was intended for.